Good morning and welcome to BeefLink TV, your daily dose of industry information. This morning I'm joined by Robert Windsor, Member Policy and Compliance Director, to talk about the further importance of due diligence and why our members need to be aware of this topic and the things that they can do to help prevent them being scammed or falling victim to fraudulent activity. So firstly, Robert, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
And thanks for giving me the opportunity to warn members about this.
No problem. So first of all, why are we discussing this subject today? Can you tell us a little bit more about the context behind this episode?
Yes, certainly I can. I mean, almost half light-heartedly almost last year, we had something which we called the Great Mango Scam. And I'm not going into all the details of it, but we had a lot of members who were taken for quite a lot of money. And if you actually looked at the stats which came from Europe, it's estimated that these fraudsters, and I'm not going to use them for that term really in a way, these people are criminals. And they took the European freight forwarding industry, it is estimated, for between 350 and 500 million euros. So we are not talking small amounts of money. This is organised crime, and they are targeting our sector in particular. We're an easy target, fast moving, changes in clientele, everything has to be done in a rush. And this is the scenario, if you like, that they are actually exploiting. Now,
so I was going to say, can you explain precisely the problems that members have been having, and they flagged them to us here at BEFA, haven't they?
Yes, they have. I mean, members have been coming to me, and I've had about 7 in the last fortnight. None of them wish to be named.
Wow.
And basically, it's the old adage, Christmas is coming and the criminals are coming out to make some money. And it's at this point in time that, we call it due diligence, and that sounds quite dull, dry, not very interesting. But actually, it's essential to this point in time for members to remember the old adage, know your customer. And you can only do this by doing robust due diligence. Now, I have got a caveat to add to that. We are not talking about due diligence which is going to throw up maybe everything, because these criminals are very skillful, they're very clever, and they are adopting tactics which normal due diligence may not always throw up. So I'm going to say there is no absolute safeguard on this, but basically what we are finding is that if you ask enough questions, they just move on to the next party. Okay.
Sure. So when we're talking about losses and that, how much money are we saying is involved here?
No one member wants to be named, and they don't really want to too much details. I mean, I've seen 6-figure sums. 3 of the members certainly have lost 6-figure sums, and many of them are in that £50,000 to £60,000 category. One member actually had a very tight credit control policy, so he limited it to only about 7,000. So, it is very large sums of money. And where it comes from, in a way, is because there's such a high volume of goods moving in by air freight in particular, due to the nature of the commodity that's involved, that this is a real issue. So there's a lot of shipments, high volume, and actually, unfortunately, 1 or 2 members have said they were so busy doing the job they didn't keep an eye on credit, and that's one of the problems.
Sure. So can you explain a little bit more about the differences and similarities between the types of crimes we've seen last year versus what we've seen in the last, say, fortnight or so?
Yeah, certainly I can. Last year, it was a much more, I'm going to use the word homogenous type of product. It was predominantly mangoes, and they originated from Pakistan and India in the main. There was a middleman in Dubai. There was a contact to Belgium, and rather less prosaically, Preston. Now, I've got nothing against Preston, but, it seemed a bit incongruous that you've got all these quite exotic places and then Preston. That did get closed down, fortunately, but it has re-emerged, and it's more general in the sense the commodities are wider. There is still a large proportion of fresh fruit and mangoes.
I see.
So that's it. But clothes stuff certainly is also involved. And
Okay.
this time the origin of the goods is mainly Bangladesh.
I see.
Okay. And I just want to actually emphasise, although we've called it the mango scam, that's almost a hang last year. This is actually, and I've spoken to credit control experts and people like this in the last couple of weeks, it's actually what's called a short-firm fraud. And it is it's actually quite common, apparently. It's growing. It's difficult to detect. And the other side of this fraud is very much identity fraud. What's happened is that the fraudsters, the criminals, let's be honest, because that's what they are. What they do is they take over, if you like, they buy up a company, and you can see all this information on companies' house. Companies who have been trading for some time and maybe just ticking on, small profit, small loss, whatever. They come up for sale, or they're approached by the fraudsters who buy them, change the directors. So in effect, it looks like it's a legitimate company, but there are certain checks that can be done to delve into it in a little bit more, and we'll go into that in a bit later.
Sure. I was going to say that leads me nicely on to my next question for you, Robert, was did these members, when they're dealing with these types of transactions and shipments, did they notice anything unusual about them in particular? I mean, we mentioned earlier that typically it's fruit, but was there anything else in particular that stuck out for them as thinking, this doesn't seem quite right?
Maybe not initially, but I will say this about our members, they do learn fairly quickly, and there is probably a jungle telegraph between freight forwarders, which works as effectively as anything we put out, I've got to be honest. One of the things that did crop up was the fraudulent party. They only saw the airline handling, and they didn't get involved in collection or things like that.
Right.
It was usually a freight forwarder does, everything they do. They maybe do the actual air freight. They'll do the airline handling in this country. They'll pay the airline and all of that sort of stuff. And the customs entry and delivery, and it was like they were being kept at arm's length, shall we say, the whole time, and that members perhaps didn't get to know the client as well, or they didn't feel as involved with the client as perhaps they would do normally. So that was the first thing.
I see.
The other thing, and I will emphasise this point, and I do think members will have to be very careful about this, because as you know, I do other problems that freight forwarders have, and not just the criminal. Always be very careful of the unsolicited approach. Ask yourself why. Where did this come from? Why did they ask me? Did they know anything about me? Okay, we do have the directory on the BFA website, so people go and see members and that sort of thing. And that's one of the things we offer. But if it's totally unsolicited, I would always be very aware about that. And I know, some of our members are getting very, very careful about this. As I say, in this case, everything has come from Bangladesh, which is, interesting. I mean, I have to emphasise that quite a lot of freight comes from Bangladesh, and it's perfectly legitimate. But it's just,
yes.
I mean, the other thing is the volume's always very high. And also, not necessarily just UK. A lot of European destinations involved, and it's the main ones: Germany, Belgium, France, Holland. So just be aware of that. The other thing that was most curious, and one member did flag this up to me, and he said, I should have known it was too good to be true, because he didn't even argue about the rate. So I think that's one
Right,
thing.
I see.
No negotiation. It was just, this is my rate, and, there was no, well, that's a bit expensive. Can I have a bit off? Or business, it's that sort of stuff. There was no negotiations. One of the other things which was of interest is when we looked up the two companies who have been advised to us by clients, and we have told Companies House about this sort of activity, because obviously we're very concerned on behalf of members.
Sure.
Both of them, when you actually went on Google Maps, we found they were Regis offices, which I think is highly suspicious in my own mind. I mean, you might hire out a Regis office for a meeting, but you don't actually base your headquarters there, I would suggest. Now, the other thing that was,
Especially several companies' headquarters, right, Robert?
Yeah. The other thing that we noticed, because we actually have looked quite carefully into this, we've done a lot of work on this behind the scenes, is that, and credit control people who are experts in this have also talked us through this, is that fraudulent companies usually have a change of directorship when they're bought, obviously. And so you've got, for companies which have been, ticking over with the same directors for a good few years, all of a sudden change of directorship. And a lot of directors have changed, all of them actually. The nature of what they do often changes as well. One case was a cleaning company that suddenly became a fresh fruit and vegetable importer. That in itself I thought was odd. Now, the other thing that we've noticed is that the figures, the reporting of the figures, first of all, there's two elements to that. There is the situation where you get figures which do not stack up against the volume of business which is being transacted or allegedly transacted for these short-firm frauds. So that's the first thing. The second thing,
sure,
which is unfortunately the other side of the coin, is that the figures are too perfect. In one case, the company filed its final accounts for the year 15 days after the end of its financial year. I would venture that very few companies, and that's very unusual to file them that early. So this is the sort of thing to be looking at. Talking, to members, I feel very sorry for them, because, this isn't just an error on a customs entry or something like that. Somebody's told somebody the wrong value or something like this. I mean, this is members being victims of deliberate criminal targeting. And that's a point. If anybody takes anything else away from today, this is deliberate criminal targeting of the sector.
Sure.
Okay.
So moving on to what members can do to protect themselves that bit more. Obviously, we've walked through already the different items that they should be bearing in mind, and sort of trigger points to think something isn't quite right here. What else can members do to protect themselves potentially from this happening to them?
I think the thing to bear in mind is that this is fraud, this is criminal activity. And as I've touched on before, there are two types of fraud here involved. The first is the short-firm fraud, as it's called, where you put through a massive amount of business, very short term, and basically you just disappear. And I've got an actual definition of this, which I'm going to read out verbatim. Sorry, it's a bit dull, but I think it's important. And the other thing is, if you like, I think it's an identity fraud, because what had been a legitimate company is taken over by these criminals, and they change the directors, they change the nature of the business and all of that. And it's that sort of thing. I mean, I'm going to be honest, all the credit people I've talked to in the last few days, and a gentleman called James Campbell has been extremely helpful. He's really fired up about this, and he gave me this definition. He said, short-term fraud is where fraudsters filing bogus accounts at companies' house to generate massive credit recommendations from unwitting credit reference agencies, which recommendations are then used to enable goods and services to be obtained from suppliers which will never receive payment. And that's what this definition is. So
sums it up perfectly.
James is very specific on this. I mean, his comment was one, well, just presume everybody's at it and they want to have one over on you. So just be, very suspicious, particularly if you're getting unsolicited contact. If, something's come from, a well-known contact or something, you could obviously regard that as better. Although I will say on a couple of these, there does seem a link back through other entities which might have been known sort of parties. So it's not absolutely full safe, but the unsolicited approach, I think, is still a good one.
Sure.
Okay.
So my final question for you, Robert, is what can you do to limit damage if the due diligence checks fail to spot a fraud?
Okay, well, I think we've touched upon this. When you're dealing with criminals, they've got a lot of time. To plan this, and they'll probably have several goes at several different companies. And as I said, certainly the more questions you ask, I would be very circumspect about any unsolicited party, credit terms, amounts of money you're willing to make available, and actually one of the members, they have a very strict credit control policy, although they actually stretched it a bit for this case, and they basically said, okay, we'll do the first import for you, but you basically, unless you paid us, we won't do any more. So what happens? They do the first job, second one turns up, and they say to the criminal, the fraudster, sorry, not going to handle this one, not going anywhere until such time as you paid your account.
Sure.
The other party just disappeared. And so that's, the thing is, we have got a due diligence guide on our website, and there's a due diligence guide on relating to credit control policies. And there's a second one on due diligence per shipment. It's the first one I think is going to be the most important. It covers all the points, although I will say I am going to review that and rewrite it. To be honest, we've had so much to do with this. I felt it more important to do this work than just redraft a document, which is about 98% there. And it just needs a bit of re-emphasising, and it will be dealing with what short-term fraud is. So that's that. I would say never trust data from one source. Companies' House are improving the quality of the data. I know that delisted 72,000 companies who they didn't feel met the registration criteria. And my colleague Paul Newman kindly sent me a link to an address in Essex, actually. 43,000 companies were registered there. Obviously, fraudulent. So, it's that sort of thing we're trying to do to help the members. But we're only one association. So never trust data from anyone. Things. Credit referencing agencies do offer a valuable service, if only because they've collated all the data. But they can't be expected to actually spot all the fraudulent accounts and that sort of thing, which are lodged with them. It'd be physically impossible. James, he says the only way to actually really spot this fraud is to actually inspect the accounts and to go through them yourself very carefully. Now, that will mean that I think members will, in many cases, will have to upskill themselves and learn more financial capability. I mean, I know my way around a set of accounts, but I don't think even I'd spot it. But certainly some of the people
Plus, being a fast-moving as well industry, we obviously, there's the time element that's involved in that too, isn't there? So
yes,
that's something to bear in mind.
That's a very important point to bear in mind. So it is, and that's one of the reasons we've been targeted. So that's there. I mean, other things to look at. Has this company changed its directors recently? That's one of the key things to ask yourself. Changed its activities. Is there a sudden increase in profitability? Are the accounts being filed too perfectly? So these are the sort of things. No one thing is perfect. Things, as I've said, we've got things like references. Can you take a reference from another supplier? Who's your accountant? Who's your solicitor? Those sorts of things. Go on Google Maps and have a look. I was speaking to somebody on Thursday evening, and they actually did spot a fraud only because it's on Google Maps. So I think that's important. There isn't any one fix. It's like a building up of a series of filters, if you like, and basically, I think be suspicious. I was reading something about scams which are happening in India, which are originating in Laos. I mean, these are unfortunately, the web is a wonderful thing in certain ways, but it's a nightmare in others.
Sure. There's definitely loads of variables to think about for our members. And again, thank you very much for walking us through all of those different variables, things to think about, things to look out for. There's definitely a sort of profile that we've sort of built up over the course of the episode here of things, but equally, you and your team are there to support them with any help and support information they may need. And as you mentioned earlier, we do have our good practice guides available as well, don't we?
Yeah, and I mean, the one thing I've touched on, but it may not stop you being defrauded, but I think it will limit any damage. It's set a very clear credit limit, and I learnt that because my first finance director was Scottish, and he was very, very harsh on this. Clear credit limits, make sure they're not exceeded, and basically get the money in ASAP.
And that's sound advice for us to end on, Robert. So thank you again so much for joining us this morning and for raising awareness of this very important topic.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you. That's all for today's episode of Beef Link TV, your daily dose of industry information.